Move your butt. Dumb broad does this every time. And here she is, the one and only Queen of Sheba. What were you doing up there? Whatever it was, I bet it cost me money.
Well, you don't think I hang around here for the conversation, do you?
Get in the car.
The whole world is waiting for GTA 6, so it's time to take a look at where it all began.
And watch her. She can be trouble.
Yeah. I'm sure your new lapdog has everything covered. And isn't he big and strong? Hey, Fighter, let's go visit Chico and get some party treats. He's at the rail station at the Chinatown waterfront, I think.
See, that's the kind of dedication we have.
Okay, so that sentence was already wrong in several aspects. For one thing, the game series didn't begin with its third installment, but the way we know GTA today, that was probably the start of the series. And on the other hand, this isn't really the original game from the year 2001 that we're seeing, but rather the highly controversial Definitive Edition that came out a few years ago. And whether the game can still captivate as much as it did back then, and whether the Definitive Edition is still as terrible as it was back then, that's what we're going to find out now. GTA 3 was actually the first GTA back then to feature a fully fleshed out story, even if it wasn't particularly creative or imaginative. Because GTA 3 takes place in the fictional city of Liberty City, which is of course based on New York City in the year 2001. You take on the role of a nameless hero, whom we now know from other games is named Claude. Claude is a small-time crook who fulfills a few jobs here and there, but is then betrayed by his allies and is supposed to be locked up.
Sorry, babe. I'm an ambitious girl. You're just small time.
Through a few twists and turns, however, he manages to escape and subsequently tries to make a name for himself in Liberty City.
Aye, get lost.
Sounds somewhat very similar to the other GTA stories, and of course I've left out a few small details now, but what can already be said is that the story is really not at the level that you might be used to from Rockstar games today. So there won't be any insane dramatic plot twists or anything like that. There are maybe one or two surprising moments that you wouldn't have seen coming regarding what happens to certain characters, but otherwise this super finely crafted story-driven game that you know from Rockstar nowadays just didn't exist back then. But you can hardly blame them for that. On the other hand, it is the first GTA that actually has cutscenes, because the other two GTAs and the spin-off GTA London didn't really have cutscenes but rather text pop-ups, and they were also very different in the direction because they were shown top-down from above and so on. And yeah, that was quite an impressive thing to see. I think that's also what triggered the hype that the series has had ever since. And as I said, for the time, the cutscenes are actually staged quite nicely. They're never really long or drawn out. They're mostly very short and really only happen before main missions, but they're quite nice and are also professionally voiced, which however cannot be said about our main character, because he doesn't speak a single word throughout the entire game, which is of course also very un-Rockstar-like nowadays. But back then they probably wanted to keep it that way so that you could identify more with the person. However, the other characters are partly voiced by well-known Hollywood stars, which is also quite nice. And if you know them a little bit, you can definitely recognize their voices, and they do their job very, very well.
Remember, this is your foot in the door, so keep your eyes on the road and off Misty.
The graphics behind the game are a bit, I'd say, cartoony, so it has its own style, and somehow the anatomy of the figures doesn't always look that great, nor do the movements and so on. That could, of course, be due to its age, but the old GTA games always had a bit of this exaggerated look, and that has become a bit more pronounced in the Definitive Edition. All the character models were reworked again, and that really is a matter of taste. You either have to like it or you don't. I can understand both opinions. I had to get into a bit myself at first because especially with the newer GTAs like GTA 4, 5 and also Red Dead Redemption here, you're much more used to the realism that games have today. And back then, it just wasn't like that, but it actually fits quite well into this world. Yeah, and the tech and graphics themselves. I actually think the game looked really neat back then. It obviously left every gamer's mouth agape at the time because you had simply never seen anything like it before, and because it was also the first game that was truly open world in a city setting where you could just do so many things. And it just looked good back then as well. The definitive edition obviously didn't look so great at the beginning and was unbelievably buggy, and the hate it received is really understandable and justified. But you have to give Rockstar, or whoever is behind it, credit for patching these definitive editions to death. And by now they are really worth looking at and also very playable. Especially lighting effects and reflections that didn't exist before really look great, but also some textures in cars or streets look really neat. And I think they really pulled a lot out of it and don't quite deserve all that hate anymore. I can understand when people say that a bit of the charm gets lost. I felt that way too. I looked at a few comparisons videos because I didn't have the original completely clear in my head anymore, and the lighting mood back then was a bit different. It was also partly a bit foggier in the city and so on, and that all contributed a bit to the atmosphere. That unfortunately gets lost a bit in the definitive edition now. But I think you can still appreciate why this game was such a huge hype back then, and you can really still have fun with it today, because it also runs incredibly smoothly. But even today it's not 100% free of bugs. I've encountered one or two as well, but definitely not in a way where you would say, okay, this is completely unplayable. It plays very well by now, and if you don't have the games yet, buying the definitive edition is actually quite worthwhile now. Because, of course, they also built in a few new features and improvements that we'll talk about later. As I said, the playground here is Liberty City, which is very heavily based on New York City, and you can explore it freely. You have 3 districts that are unlocked little by little, and you can explore the city from front to back. That's usually done in a car, of course, otherwise the game wouldn't carry that name. And the big feature, I say, was that you could drive any car you saw just by stealing it, hence the name, which is pretty self-explanatory. But that was already super fascinating back then, simply that you could stop every car on the street and just take it if you wanted to. And that was done very, very cool, and it controls well too. It still controls a bit floaty, and you might have to get used to the driving controls a little, but otherwise a good sense of speed comes across, and the size of the city is also very noticeable when you rush through it in a car. Actually, in GTA 3, cars weren't the only thing you could drive, because every now and then you are even allowed to grab a boat and coast across the river with it for a bit, and that works quite nicely as well. In the definitive edition, luckily the map was also reworked a little. It is now a bit clearer, and additionally you now have a navigation system which didn't exist before. Back then you just had to drive after the icons on the map or forge your own path. That obviously had pros and cons. If you didn't have this navigation mode, you memorized the city a bit better and found your own routes, but nowadays, in this day and age, you would obviously miss something like that if it didn't show you where you actually have to drive. And that's why I think that's quite good too. I also thought that, especially back in the day, the game had a really well done damage model. So the cars crumble together and bend, doors fly off, or even the hood falls off at some point, and that looked really impressive back then, and I still think it's pretty cool today. What I didn't find so cool on the other hand was that the cars sometimes really can't take much. So whether it's collisions or gunshots from other people, it really didn't take long until they started burning and exploding, and then you really have a problem, and that was unfortunately a bit annoying. And I can't remember if it was like that in the original version back then, or if that only came through the definitive edition. Of course, if you want to, you can also explore Liberty City on foot, although that would take way too long, but of course that's an option too. You can get out at any time and walk around, and that control's a bit clunky as well, unfortunately, and Claude doesn't really get his butt into gear, let's say, when you try to get him to run a bit faster. Naturally, there's also shootout gameplay, because sometimes you have to defend yourself against other gangsters or the like using weapons, and there are plenty of those, which you can either find or buy in shops, which is also a pretty nice idea. And here too, in the definitive edition, the shooting mechanics have been reworked a bit, because they were still very clunky in the original, but now you have a classic third-person over-the-shoulder aiming system, so to speak. It's still not perfect, not as good as in today's games, but it definitely works much better than back then, and also avoids a bit of frustration, because back then the gunfights were a bit of a gamble, and that simply works better today. And it's fun to try out the different weapons like that, because the hit feedback and what happens afterwards is all very nicely done. And of course, that's why the game also invites you to cause a lot of nonsense away from the story. And of course you can also just walk or drive through the city for hours and shoot everything up, or get yourself some larger vehicles to be a bit more effective. And that has always been what set GTA apart, this freedom to just cause some real nonsense. In that regard, it's perhaps also good to know that actually all the cheats from the original game still work, which then contribute a little bit more to you being able to cause real chaos in the city. Yeah, but the main task in GTA 3 is, of course, to complete the main missions and thus push the story forward. And that is unfortunately also kind of the biggest sticking point of the game, because even though the missions are actually all quite different, there are only a few duplicates, let's say, where you have to do the same thing, they are still incredibly frustrating at times. And that's for a specific reason. Because up until GTA 5, I think Rockstar never thought, why should we ever build checkpoints into our missions? Because every time you mess up a mission, you have to do it completely from scratch. You might not have to drive through the missions yourself anymore. I think you are spared with that. You start in the initial cutscene again, but it's just incredibly frustrating when you spend minutes working on a mission and then something stupid happens, which can always happen in open world games like this, and then you have to do everything all over again from the start. And that drove me so mad at times, because there are also a few missions that are simply no longer contemporary. Some of them are so unfair or have a timer attached and it's so tight that you really have to rush yourself, which really just drives you insane. And so I had to look up simpler ways on the internet for some parts to see how to complete these missions more effectively and better, and then I realized that most people are frustrated by these missions as well. And that's unfortunately game design that just doesn't work so well anymore today. In addition to the main missions, there are also side missions that you can pick up from payphones, for example. These don't really differ that much in their tasks from the main missions, except that there are no real cutscenes or the story being pushed forward, and you don't have to do them to finish the story. But other than that, there's not much to it. However, there are a few extra missions if you're sitting in a taxi or a police car, for example. You can activate various missions there. In a taxi you can chauffeur different people from A to B, and in police missions you have to apprehend fleeing criminals. That's also quite nice because it brings you a bit of extra money, and you can just do that on the side if you happen to be sitting in one of those cars. The frustrating thing, however, is that there are gangs roaming around the entire city, and the game essentially features a gang system. And within the story, you sometimes can't avoid getting onto the bad side of one of these gangs, and then they shoot at you every single time they see you. Regardless of whether you're just walking past or driving by, they shoot you up every time. And that ruined 1 or 2 missions for me, because they naturally do that during missions as well. So it can happen that they set your car on fire very quickly and it explodes, or they simply shoot you in the middle of the street. And that is sometimes just really annoying and frustrating. They should have at least suspended that during missions. When you unlock the different districts, you also get garages where you can park your cars, as well as a safe house where you're allowed to save. And I would advise you to do that, so that if you die in a mission, you don't lose all your weapons as in the case, but can simply load your save file instead, because otherwise it gets even more frustrating. So you have to try to help yourself out a bit there. Yeah, I actually hadn't played GTA 3 in decades. I never owned it myself for the PS2 back then either, and that's why I never really played it all the way through. And I didn't remember it being so frustrating, I must say. Now I've actually played through it for the first time in the definitive edition, and I can definitely see why this game was so hyped back then, or what triggered all that hype. You just hadn't seen anything like that back then, and it was simply incredibly fascinating. It fascinated me hugely back then as well. It was a lot of fun again today, because I also just love this whole style of GTA. Since GTA itself is just a complete satire of the USA or today's world, which you also notice on the radio stations, for example, which are all included again. Super funny and brilliantly produced, with great music, but also with these great radio shows in between. You can listen to Laszlo interviewing different people who are all so crazy, and that's just a blast, and it adds to the madness behind GTA even more. And that's why the game definitely has my full respect. But especially nowadays, I have to say, the game frustrates me more than it gives me enjoyment. Yeah, like I said, the game definitely has my respect for introducing this open world formula, this GTA formula, so well, but I unfortunately only had moderate fun with it because many things are simply down to its age, of course, and yeah, so outdated that they really should have gone back and reworked them. That's why I can give GTA 3 a 7 out of 10. I can understand if other people might give it a higher rating, but that's also a bit of nostalgia. And yeah, I personally have to evaluate it from today's perspective, and there the level and checkpoint design in particular is so outdated that they definitely should have tweaked something there or whatever, and I definitely aged a few years while playing it. But hey, if you want to see where this whole open world GTA craze started, then you can definitely take a look at GTA 3 and also at the definitive editions, because they are actually really well patched now and are a very good way to experience the classics.
If he squeals, I squeal!
You're an efficient killer. I like that in a man.
With me, you get a lot of bang for your buck.
I see nothing but good things for you, my boy. Anything you want.